Council for Monday, September 17th. Like to recognize that we're doing our business today on the traditional territory of the Hupatchisitt and Sishot First Nations. And before we adopt the agenda, just apologize that our delegation, the Alberni Valley Senior Citizens Home Society, wasn't fully aware that this was a complete public meeting and that there are some support documents that they are just received now. So what we'll do is to have the CAO review the entire agenda and the supporting documents before we really begin talking about it too much, just so that everybody's a little bit closer to the same page. So with that in mind, Council, a motion to adopt the agenda, please.
I'll make that motion, Mr. Mayor.
Second, Mr. Mayor.
Any discussion?
As is, Mr. Mayor.
As is, I believe, unless there's something that you would prefer not be discussed. No? Okay, we're all right? Okay.
So have delegations then.
Yeah. Okay, all those in favor then? Carried. Okay, so before we turn it over to you, let's just have our CAO just review the package for us and just make sure that we're all fully aware of the documents and the significance of those documents. And it would give you a little bit of extra time just to review those documents that we may be referring to. Sorry? You do not have copies of these documents. No, are they being made for you now? Yes. Okay.
Mr. Mayor, hard copies of the agenda package are being photocopied now for the delegation. And I apologize on behalf of staff for not making you aware that there was an agenda package. So, Mr. Mayor, you have an agenda in front of you for the special meeting. The special meeting is for the purpose of receiving a delegation from the Alberni Valley Senior Citizens Home Society. You will recall that the society was in front of council at your last regular meeting with a request to have this meeting to discuss, among other things, a permissive tax exemption. So the agenda package that you have before you includes a report from the city clerk with information regarding permissive tax exemption, the city's process, and specific to the society. It includes community charter excerpts, the city's permissive tax exemption current policy, and bylaws supporting that policy. And we also have with us Diane Koch. Diane is working in support of our finance department right now, and you'll recall that Diane was previously our deputy director of finance, and Diane's well-versed in the city's permissive tax exemption policy. So, Mr. Mayor, if you like, I can review the city clerk's report, and Felicia can support me by putting it on the screen. We can walk through that together.
That'd be great. Thank you.
So the issue of the report is that information for council, this is information for council regarding the city's permissive tax exemption process and background, the background regarding the Alberni Valley Senior Citizens Home Society request to assist, this is to assist council's understanding in the decision making. Yeah, can I take one of those? And the rest of the society. Thank you. So the city has currently has a permissive tax exemption policy. And and that means that that council can consider applications from eligible bodies, property owners, to be exempt from a portion or all of the property tax on a property. And our policy is enabled by the province's community charter. So the province enables us to have a permissive tax exemption program, and the province sets some guidelines on that, and then the city, within the scope of that community charter allowance, the city sets specific terms around the city's policy. So if we just scroll down, Alicia. So with regard to the Pioneer Cottage permissive tax exemption, there is some history to this property, and Diane, are you okay to speak to that? Or do you want me to continue on? Why don't I continue on, and if you have questions, we can ask Diane. So as I understand it, the society owns Pioneer Towers and the cottages. The Pioneer Cottages, is that what we're calling them? Yes? Okay. Okay, cottages and tower. Now, the tower is eligible and receives a permissive tax exemption. The cottages, and many on council will recall the old cottages that used to be there, used to receive a permissive tax exemption. And they were eligible, being built at a time when they were eligible for the city's tax exemption. They were demolished and rebuilt, some very nice structures, and rented to probably some new tenants. And unfortunately, nobody at the time, the society nor the city, were aware that because the provincial regulations had changed, the new cottages were no longer eligible for a tax exemption. And I'm looking at the society to see if I'm making a mistake on this. And for a couple of years, they actually got an exemption, and then BC Assessment said, hey, by the way, these buildings are not eligible for an exemption. So the society worked with the city to see how they could become eligible. And one of the challenges is, the province's community charter enables the city to give a tax exemption to structures, property in this classification. But the city's policy says that there has to be, it's not enough that it's senior-only housing, it has to be affordable senior housing or rent-controlled. I'm seeing the heads nod. So the society, not knowing that, rented the property and to the current tenants. When they found out that they were not eligible for a tax exemption and their costs were higher than their rent was covering, they have tried to raise the rent, and voluntarily, their tenants have not agreed to a voluntary rent increase. It's left the society in a loss position where they're not covering their costs because they had anticipated a tax exemption, or they had anticipated not paying taxes, and unfortunately that is not the case. So the society is before council asking for council to change the city's policy in this regard to enable the society to receive a tax exemption. Am I getting that? Is that the ask? Mostly? Now, the report goes on to tell council what are some of the challenges around this. And the challenges are that without some, so this is a below market rate rental, but without some proof that the tenants are eligible for, basically an income test, are eligible for controlled rent, below market rent, then it doesn't fall within the scope of the city's bylaw to exempt those properties from taxes. And there are other properties in the city that are housing senior folks, citizens over 55 years of age, who do not receive tax exemptions. So it would be a bit of a challenge for the city to enable this property specifically to receive a tax exemption when there's other buildings in a similar situation not receiving that. And I'm sure the society can inform you on their perspective of that. Alicia, if we can scroll down a bit. So one example that the city clerk's report points out is that should the society enter into or move forward with a means test for their tenants, even in a graduated way, the city could consider a graduated tax exemption. And the example, excuse me, given is the King George Apartments across Argyle Street from us on Fifth Avenue, has a number of suites that are specified for Canadian Mental Health Association, or leased through them, and so that portion of the building, on a basis, basically on a fraction basis, that portion of the building is eligible for permissive tax exemption. And so the clerk's report has a calculation of how we get to that. Is part of the building is tax exempt, the remainder pays full tax. And that process could be applied here, and in that way the society could be eligible for a partial tax exemption, and then as time goes by and their tenants change and they apply a means test to their tenancy, they could over time receive a full tax exemption. That's not going to help the society today. they probably don't have the time to get there. So the options outlined by, and I see you have some questions, Mr. Mayor. I'm just going to read you the options, and then I'll get out of the way. The options identified by the clerk include, well, regardless of anything, of anything else we do, we need to undertake a review of the city's permissive tax exemption policy in 2019 anyway. And that needs to be part of the 5-year financial planning process. So that is a recommendation that we continue with that, with those steps. And another option that you could consider is you could consider a 1-year exemption for the society for 2019 for either full or partial exemption, excuse me, as long as the society can demonstrate that at least a portion of their units are rented to low-income seniors. And that's basically what I talked about earlier. The third option is council could consider a 1-year exemption for the society for 2019 for all or partial exemption without any requirement for the society to transition towards verification of low-income status for their tenants. And the fourth option is council could deny the request for exemption based on the fact that the society did not apply by the appropriate deadline for consideration. Now, in fairness to the society, excuse me, when they had last interacted with us, I think 2 years ago, and were not eligible, they haven't applied for an exemption since. So because of that, they've not met the city's timeline for 2019. I believe those are all the options, Mr. Mayor.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Summick?
Thank you to CAO for explaining these matters. One question I have for the public interest as into what is the definition of the means test, and is it mandatory to be eligible for this permissive tax?
Can you figure that?
That falls under the
Can you go-
policy.
can you go to the mic?
Sorry.
Mr. Mayor, Ms. Koch is better equipped to answer that than I am.
So if I can just find it here. If you can go to the policy, I think, Alicia. So this is the city's policy, and within the policy, there are specific guidelines. Actually, the towers or the Pioneer cottages used to be statutorily exempt, and then they lost that exemption when they actually bulldozed and built the new ones. So that's where the problem lies, is that they didn't get the statutory exemption, so then they were not eligible for the permissive tax exemption. So,
Page 57.
oh, thanks, Ron.
No, just
Well, I was just looking up here. If we go a little bit further down in the policy, it'll show up there. Eligibility, yeah. So it would be seniors care facility is what they would have to qualify under, and they're not a care facility. So the only other thing that we could go with was an income test for low-income seniors. And that was decided at the CIP meetings.
Okay, thank you. Councillor McLennan?
Yeah, I guess it's all well and good what we have in the reports here, but the recommendation is a motion to review our policy prior to the next budget. So really, this could all change. So maybe I think we should go back to our agenda and hear from the delegation what they need, because we've not heard that yet.
Right.
They were here and there wasn't time to present it. So if they could present that, and now they know what some of the rules are, and I didn't know that it was, the last I heard, it was because of the statutory exemption taken away is the only reason they couldn't get it. Is that correct, or am I'm hearing two things here.
Well, the statutory exemption was taken away. The one that they fell under was because they built a building between 1935 and 1974, and it was a provincial program that gave them statutory exemption. And because when people get a statutory exemption within the city generally allows them to have a permissive tax exemption for the land around the statutory exemption. Churches are one example of that. And the rest of the hospitals, private hospitals. So because they had that taken away, they then fell into a different category. There is nothing for us to go by other than what the policy says.
So, Mr. Mayor, I'd suggest we hear from the delegation, or be here all day trying to explain to them what we're not sure about.
Right. Well, okay, thank you very much. Councillor Minions, did you have a question before we go to the delegation?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, because there's nothing actually in our procedures or in our bylaw that talks about means testing. So, Director Koch or Diane, not sure what you are today, but thank you for being here. You mentioned that, did that come from the committee? Because I think that's where a lot of the confusion is lying, that there's nothing in our actual bylaw that says means testing, but we've been referring to means testing a lot.
I think that came from the committee.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Mayor, just further question, would a means test apply for a statutory exemption? Is that what that would trigger?
The statutory exemptions are within the charter, so that's
Mhm.
the provincial government setting out what those things are.
Yeah, but I'm just wondering if the means test discussion was to enable the society to qualify under provincial regulation, not city policy. Okay.
Okay, so let's turn over to our delegation and see what you've been doing a lot of work in the last few weeks, and I know Walter Hoogland's here with you as some special consultant, and I'm wondering if, maybe you've discovered some things that would be good for council to know.
Well, do I need to talk? I guess I need to talk up here. So, thank you for allowing us to address you. You would have received our package, and hopefully you have had time to review it. And seconding what Councillor Minions has said, and our basic argument is the same thing as she pointed out, that there's nothing in the permissive tax exemption policy that talks about means testing. Nothing. The thing that we think we fall under, no, we are not a care facility, although some people think we are. Facilities or programming for youth and seniors. We have a facility for seniors. And the idea of means testing, we cannot means test. And many of our seniors in the cottages, as well as the towers, qualify for SAFER. I don't know if you know about the SAFER grant, but SAFER grant is for people with low income, and it pays a portion of their rent.
Mm-hmm.
So already some of our tenants qualify for SAFER. So we know they're low income. Their rent is below, many of them, not the new tenants, but many of the tenants that have been there since construction, pay below market rent. Before the residential tenancy branch took out that part of the application for additional rent increase, we had how many pages did we have? Hundreds of pages of comparable rents to our facility, the cottages. There was nothing in this town that even compared with them physically, and the rent that they were at the original rent was below anything in this town. So, we already had low rent, but we didn't have I don't believe we have, and we don't currently have, the legal right to means test our tenants. So we will never qualify for some committee decision that was sent to council, I guess, to make means test part of our eligibility for permissive tax exemption. We truly believe that we qualify. And the reason we didn't apply for the last 2 years was because we were told by Mr. Ply that we didn't qualify because of this, and we thought, well, we can't means test people. We don't have the legal right to means test our tenants.
So then, just a quick question about that. I looked online to see what, comparable rents would be online, and, we're probably looking more in the $750 to $800 range. And the shelter aid for the SAFER, the shelter aid for elderly renters program, there's a threshold in this area of singles of $734 and couples of $800. And I'm wondering if that in any way would impact in what you could be charging to your tenants. Because the way I understand it is that if you were charging close to the $750 to the $800, then they would be able to get this reduction on it if they met whatever the provincial requirement was for income, yeah. But that wouldn't be you administering it, it would be the province administering it.
Right.
And I also noticed that the taxes, and I don't understand really why, and probably none of us ever do, but the taxes from in 2017 declined to 37,600 from 46,400 the year before, so there's about a $9,000 decline. Do you know why that happened, or is it just one of these mysteries of provincial assessment?
Probably. And, you know, the buildings are 1 year older. Maybe that has something to do with it. I don't know.
Okay.
You know, do we ever know why our taxes on our houses go up and down? And no, we don't.
Yeah, okay, so
Yeah.
I just, not that I'm
So-
opposed to the city helping, I just think probably on a long term, the tax exemption program is probably really on a long-term basis the wrong tool to really help.
Well, to go back to what you were saying, we do know that about how if the rents went up to $750 or $800, that SAFER would kick in for many people.
Yeah,
And at our last meeting with the tenants, we had David O'Shaney, our accounting firm, and his wife Brenda come and explain to the tenants that really they would qualify for SAFER and it wouldn't be a huge increase to them personally when it came to paying their rent.
okay,
We still got nowhere with the tenants. They still believed that what we were telling them wasn't right, despite the fact that they had the financials and the accountant explained it. And they just were not interested in accepting our request for a voluntary rent increase.
okay,
So currently, the income from the cottages, because of this ongoing tax thing and our inability to raise the rents, the last fiscal report, it's in your package, they're at a deficit of $50,000 plus of revenue over, is under the cost, the expenses. And we can't continue this way. So our request to you today is for a tax exemption, and yes, it's late, but I believe it's still in the late application period that's allowed, to get us through this crisis until we can, number one, get hopefully some long-term financing and deal with this shortfall of revenue.
mm-hmm. And were there any other programs that you were able to be directed through BC Housing or provincial government somewhere else that may assist you? Any other possibilities?
We're still in discussion with BC Housing, and we have hopes of that, but we have no guarantees.
Right.
And so currently our mortgage on those cottages is up for renewal November 1st. And if we probably won't get anything nailed down with BC Housing by then. So our monthly mortgage payment will go up $2,000 a month on November 1st, adding to the $50,000 shortfall.
Right.
So we are not in a very good position. In fact, it's just about crisis time.
Right. Councillor McLennan?
Yeah, the more I'm looking at this and hearing it, and I was away last week, and I didn't think this meeting was today, so I wasn't not overly prepared for it. That was some other day, and was coming back all of a sudden, whoopsie. But so this year you're in a bind, is what I'm hearing. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you probably can't keep functioning if nothing changes.
That's correct.
So the cottages, whatever they're called, and the Pioneer Towers would be essentially shut down.
Well, we don't want to go there. But
I know
you
that,
know.
but we don't want to
Yeah.
go there is good,
Yeah.
but is that where you're at financially?
Are we?
Good afternoon. And if by chance we're not successful with the tax exemption for the cottages, it could result, and we're hoping BC Housing is able to work with us, is that we might be forced to strata it, sell it, whatever we might have to do. And any funds we get from that will help us to put the new facade on Pioneer Towers. So we're looking at over, well, we're not sure, because with Walter, we're looking at engineering firms to size it up again. But we were given a preliminary amount of 1.5 million. So if we sold the cottages, got the money out of that, we might be able to save the towers. But we're not sure if we can even do that. Yeah.
See, sorry, Councillor McClellan, were you finished?
Well, I got the part of the answer, but I'll just wait. Other people, I'm sure, got questions. But my suggestion would be that we take one of those options we saw on the screen whenever it was designed for, give them a 1-year break, and then find out what we're going to make permanent. Because I don't think we want to lose the cabins or the Pioneer Towers. Due to finances, there's been no repairs done, particularly on the towers, and it's coming down. Or at least the facade isn't in very good shape and leaks, I'm told, in some places, and you don't have to give us all the details on it now, but that's just my suggestion, and someone else, I'm sure, has got something else to say.
I would agree. I'd like to, I'm leaning towards an emergency exemption of some sort for 1 year. Because
Okay, can I make that motion?
I'm
Then
certain.
I move we give them one year, whatever we call it, permissive tax exemption, or the smart one down here is gonna tell me I got the right or wrong words, and follow through on the recommendation for 2020.
I'll second that motion if we specify which option we're talking about here.
Okay. Although I would actually prefer to refer to it as an emergency grant equivalent to a 1-year tax exemption rather than.
That's what I was saying, well, 1 year, I didn't say emergency grant, but that's probably a better word than mine.
Councillor Minions, you had a question?
I just wanted to speak to that. I think what you brought forward about, if as a very last resort, potentially stratifying those and selling. There had been talk in the public about if the whole complex was sold, that tenants' rights would be protected. Those tenants would end up staying regardless and paying low rent still. But if they were stratified and sold, which I would agree would be the option that would make sense for the society, those units would probably all be sold to people moving here from the mainland, cashing out of their homes there and looking for small patio homes to live in. So all of those tenants would be displaced, I would imagine, for sure. I think I support the motion for looking at this as an emergency situation, but I do want to go back to means testing. I recognize that it's not in our bylaws right now, and I think it's critical that we do review those bylaws regardless of what we do with this. There's a lot of inconsistencies in our priorities that are set in that bylaw, in my opinion. But I do think that when we talk about permissive tax exemptions, it should be to people who need the relief. I think we should be critical that we are, giving help to people who need the help, and not just giving tax exemptions because people who are older than 55 live there. So I'm not sure. I know that you made a comment that you don't think you have the right to means test. And I certainly don't have the information on that, but I think it's important that that is looked at, that you guys, explore that, because I do think that if we review our bylaw in the next year, most likely we're going to end up coming to means testing. I know just from my experience with the Rainbow Gardens Board and the project that they're working on for independent living, they are affordable housing, and there will be means testing done. They may fall under something completely different than what you guys do, so it'll be your prerogative to review it. But I know that other societies do it in some capacity. So I think if we want to give long-term help, that realistically has to be looked at in whatever capacity you guys are able. And I think that's all. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Sauvé?
Just a quick question, please. You mentioned the application, certain senior programs being offered not only from the towers but possibly from the cottages. Is there any such programs being offered?
No, there's no programs, and when I read this thing, it talks about facilities or programming,
Okay.
not and, for youth and seniors. That's where we thought we fell.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
You're going to have to wait. Councillor Washington?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm willing to support option 2 because it seems to answer Councillor McClement's questions and Councillor Minion's questions. But just a comment that I think if this was anybody else, we would have just said, we'd have turned it down cold. So, but it involves seniors, and we have to accommodate our seniors. It's very important that we accommodate our seniors. So I'd be willing to support option 2 if the rest of the group would see fit for that.
Could I just ask one question? Are 100% of the people in the cottages 65 or older?
55.
Okay, so then some
Many
of them
of them
wouldn't
are
actually be
85.
considered seniors at this point.
Well, we've never figured out what the legal definition of seniors is, you know. At Hudson's Bay, it's 50, and at Shoppers, it's 55, and
BC Housing is 55.
BC Housing is 55.
Okay.
So, you know, any one of us might fall into that category or not.
I was just thinking seniors in terms of,
Yeah.
you know,
Oh,
pensions,
yes.
pensions
No,
and
for,
stuff.
for
Yeah.
senior housing through BC Housing, the actual age is 55.
Yeah,
Okay, thank you.
Don't
Uh,
get confused with the government with 65 for pensions.
yeah.
CAO.
Mr. Mayor, a couple of points. So regardless of what council does, staff requests that you consider the 2 motions that are there already. Let's see if we can scroll down to those. So one would be receiving the report. The other one would be that you direct staff to arrange a meeting for council to review the policy in early 2019. So those are innocuous to this discussion, but they're helpful to move the process along. And further to that, if council decides or wants to consider, and I've heard the term one-time grant here, I would suggest that a grant is a cleaner path than an exemption that flies in the face of our policy and our recommendation from CIP. And the amount that, again, scrolling up, if you don't mind, Alicia, to the options, I'm seeing the amount of city taxation at $25,350. So that is an amount that council should bear in mind, whether you want to grant that or a portion of that. That's my advice, Mr. Mayor.
Councillor McClellan.
Yeah, I think we can vote on the motion for emergency grant for the year and then vote on the next motion. Right now, this is the one on the floor.
Okay, so the first one is the emergency grant. You haven't identified the amount at this point. So,
Covered taxes was what I said, so I'm not sure if that's, I guess I should have said city portion or all, but I did not differentiate, so. If the seconder is happy with it, I'll change it to city portion of taxes.
Okay.
Our thing.
Okay, Councillor Sauvé, are you fine with that?
Yes, I'm fine. Me, it was for the city portion of the taxes.
Okay,
Thank you.
so, Councillor Minions.
I just wanted to comment lastly that I think from the city's perspective, we should be clear that I personally don't see this as fitting under the senior facilities for senior. I think that really, and again, this is a problem with our policy, but that really broadens and sets us up on a slippery slope to give tax exemptions to any facility that does anything for seniors. I do think we need to review our policy to make it clearer, but I like the idea of putting this forward as a one-time emergency grant.
Okay, last word to Councillor Paulson.
Always the last word.
Okay.
I actually sit on the tax exemption committee, and there's nobody more surprised than we were when the provincial legislation came down. And I mean, you were a group that were already receiving a tax exemption up to that point. The other part of the confusion for me is the definition of affordable and who qualifies for affordable. And I think that's kind of where the city policy needs to be clarified as far as permissive tax exemption goes. I mean, on the gross example, you can't have a seniors care for profit place having a tax exemption. But if you're providing a service for people who basically are low income and can't afford accommodation at market rate, that's where I think that the city provides a service. And I guess I'm unclear as to the threshold of affordable and who qualifies for affordable funding. And I mean, the one option allows us to go forward, and I realize we're not going to means test anybody that's currently there, but it might be a part of the policy that new tenants have to go through that, or they just don't become tenants. But somebody who has a $100,000 a year income, possibly as a senior, might be taking advantage of affordable low rent as opposed to paying market rent. So that's some of my confusion around this whole thing, and And like I say, when we found out on the tax exemption committee that, that the BC assessment came back with that, we all kind of went, really? And sure enough, it's in black and white there. But anyway, just some comments.
Okay, Councillor Washington?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So if we give them a grant, are we gonna give them a grant, or are we gonna?
Give them a one-time grant,
One-time grant?
equivalent to the city, the motion is the city portion,
Okay, so the 25,350.
yeah.
Where would we get that? Would that be just downloaded onto the taxpayer, or
Mr. Mayor, there's,
just wondering
depending
where
on,
it's gonna come from?
depending on the direction of council, the next council. So if the next council, if the next council stays the course with a 3% cap, then we would tax for a 3% increase of that classification, and that $25,000 would be taxed from the rest of the property owners in that classification, because we would still pull the same amount of money. If we taxed in a different way, then it might just be that we would receive less money. So it depends really how the next council goes forward.
Okay,
Would there be a breakdown, say $1.25 a household, so it doesn't seem so earth-shattering?
There could be, but we couldn't give it to you right now. But there could be. It would be property, again, depending on the direction of council, where they assign the tax load. It could be shared by other property owners in the same classification, or it could be shared across the board.
so just so we're absolutely crystal clear, City Clerk, could you just read the motion, please?
Absolutely. The motion on the table right now is to give a emergency grant for the city portion of taxes being $25,350.
Okay.
Approximately.
Okay, all those in favor of the motion? Opposed? Carried. Okay, so just to be clear, it is a one-year emergency grant. It maybe gives a little bit of relief. I don't think it removes all of the concern for you, but it will help a little bit. And there's definitely some work ahead for your society and council and city staff to see what we can do for 1 year's time, or next year, 2019, because you're going to be faced with this issue again. Go ahead.
That's why we wanted to approach council initially, was that we wanted to work through the policy and find out what criteria we as a society needed in order to qualify for the permissive tax exemption. So that's why we were here today, in order to work through that. So we do appreciate what you've done for an emergency grant, and we hope that we're able to work with the either current council or new council on this for next year to put our application in.
And that's why I say, because it's a grant as opposed to, changing policy or anything, we clearly have work to do to make sure that not only council understands, but that the entire city understands the nature of how this is going to work as we work through the process.
Yeah, I would just like to mention that I work with a fantastic bunch of volunteers on our board. Our numbers have dwindled, and mainly because of all the work that has been involved with finding proper financing, and we've been working with Walter for that. But it took us a couple of years to work through all this, to have meetings with our tenants, to find financing. So we worked with the credit union and now with Walter, with BC Housing, and it's taken its toll on our group. We're volunteers. We're not in it to make any money. We just want to provide affordable, adequate, safe housing for seniors in our community.
And I'm imagining that all of us have brought this issue to Scott Fraser. I know I talked to him about it just a few weeks ago. Has he given any indication that there may be some avenue that he can assist you with, or are you still working on that?
Well, we've talked to both MP Gord Johns, and we attended his public forum on affordable housing, which most of that came out in the AV News this past week. And we've spoken to MLA Scott Fraser. And when this initially happened, Scott Fraser wrote on our behalf to City Council saying, you know, like, is there any opportunities to support us? And of course, it didn't go anywhere at that particular time. And working with Walter, he said, give it another try. So that's why we're here today. And we're just thankful for the grant that we're receiving. And like I said, we want to move forward and find out how we can qualify for next year. Okay?
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Council, we've made a decision on the options, but we actually need a motion to accept the clerk's report. Councillor McClellan?
Do we need a motion to take the report first, and I'll make it? I was just going to make this other recommended motion with a slight variation.
Okay,
So I'll move we adopt the report first. We probably should have done it an hour ago.
I second that motion.
Okay, all in favor? Carried, thank you.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to move the Council City of Port Alberni direct staff to arrange a meeting for council to discuss and review its policy provision of permissive tax exemptions in early 2019 in conjunction with the 5-year financial plan process and prior to inviting applications for 2010 with special emphasis on what is happening at Pioneer Towers and the cottages. I have a second, I'll explain why I added it.
Okay,
Mr. Mayor, the Pioneer Towers and the cottage were built, I didn't do my history and get the exact date. You got the date?
The towers
71.
Yeah, I can remember it, so it's not that long ago.
and the cottages were built in 1960s.
Yeah. So, and they were done with the community, a lot of funding from the community groups, the unions, the companies, and so on. And there was a reason they were set up the way they were, and maybe that reason doesn't hold so well today. But there's some things obviously in their bylaws and whatnot and contracts that people have signed, and they feel they can say, we're not going to accept any rent increase. So, yeah, well, don't work that way in the world, but I think they have a special circumstance, and that's what we're going to have to help them work out. So that's why I put that in there, Mr. Mayor.
okay, thank you. Councillor Sylvia?
Yeah, I just want to echo, Councillor Minions said it best. This is going to give us an opportunity within a year to revise our own policy and so forth. The big concern of the importance of doing this, because this is not the only senior facilities in our community that this might affect, and it could be a bigger avalanche than we think. A lot of these facilities are not applying or have been declined the permissive tax. So again, it's Councillor Minion is absolutely right. We need to get on this policy so we could send out a true message for our community. Thank you.
Just one last thing. Have you considered the annual rent increase that you're permitted, up now 4.5%?
As you know, we've approached the tenants for a voluntary rent increase. The additional rent increase application is a very difficult process. It's not something that you can just say, in 3 months' time, your rent is. Gay and I have compiled an additional rent increase for both Pioneer Cottages and another separate application for Pioneer Towers. We do not know if they'll be read together or that they will grant one and maybe not another. And it could be a stepped-in program, or it could be totally declined one over the other. We don't know. So being that it's a difficult process, you're not able to use the 4.5% on the units that you're asking for the additional rent increase until you have submitted it to the residential tenancy branch.
Okay.
So that's why we have not been able to increase our rents.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you. That explains that. Okay, then, council, on the motion, all those in favor? Carried. Thank you very much. That brings to the end of our meeting, and a motion to adjourn, council. Seconder? Second. All in favor? Opposed? Carried. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.